Welcome. I'm Pamela Rickia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Lucas Land. Hi, Lucas.
Hi, glad to be here.
Oh, yay. I'm really excited to have you here as well. Just to let people know, I recently connected with Lucas when he invited me to be a guest on his new podcast. I had a great time chatting with him, so I thought it would be wonderful to have him on to share his family's unschooling experiences up to this point anyway. And I am very happy he agreed. So to get us started, Lucas, can you share a bit with us about you and your family?
Yeah. So we currently live in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. I'm working with Mennonite. We are both working with, me and my wife, working with Mennonite Central Committee here. This is our second time actually working in Bolivia. And we have 3 kids. Our oldest, Asher, is 13. Lydia is 11. And Dorothy, the youngest, is 6. So one of the big, I'll probably talk more about this, but right now they go to a school here in Bolivia because homeschooling in general is not recognized as a legal form of education. There are some groups that are advocating for homeschooling here, but because of being foreigners and working with an international organization, we kind of have to follow more closely the laws. And so that's a whole other kind of thing. Unschooling in school is kind of a weird dynamic, but yeah, so that's us. What else? I'm not sure what else to say about us. We enjoy role-playing games and board games. All the kids kind of like that stuff. Of course, like a lot of kids, they're into YouTube and video games and all that kind of stuff. We've been happy that our internet is good enough that especially our oldest, Asher, he plays a lot of online games and has a kind of a group of friends that he connects with through gaming, and he's been able to keep that up living here. So that's been good too.
Yeah, that's a great bonus. But, to be able to, especially when you're traveling to new places, right, to be able to continue to do the things that you really enjoy is, I imagine, a really helpful part of the transition, right?
Yeah, definitely. Since we first got here, he already had a group that he knew some from Texas, where we're from, but also from, he had a friend from somewhere in Europe and another that is also an expat living in Argentina. So he's kind of connecting with people all over the place.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So how did you guys originally discover unschooling, and what did your family's transition into that unschooling lifestyle look like?
Yeah, so we had kids, our 2 oldest, while I was studying theology in seminary. And we didn't really discuss schooling too much in the beginning. But after seminary, we decided to move to this farm outside of Waco, Texas, where we are from. And the farm teaches sustainable agriculture and international development. And so I was an intern there. And so we sold our house, we moved with our 2 little kids to this farm. It's kind of with a bunch of Christian hippies. It's kind of a crazy place. It kind of collects all sorts of fun weirdos that are now our friends. But part of that, the kids were around 18 months and 3 years. So they turned 2 and 4 while we were living on the farm. And so then we began to start thinking like, what are we going to do with schooling? My wife had been an elementary music teacher for many years. So she'd been in the school system working, but she also was in a music teacher is kind of in this position where you don't have all the testing pressures. And so she enjoyed it a lot, but also saw a lot of the things that kids had to go through and deal with, and was interested in homeschooling. And so we started kind of talking about it. Mostly she was doing a lot of times she seems to do all the research and then kind of drags me along the way
Yeah.
in a lot of different things. And I think someone gave her the book Deschooling Our Lives to read. And so that was kind of an introduction to some of those ideas. And we also knew a couple of people that came through the farm while we were there who had been unschooled. So they were young adults in their 20s who had gone through unschooling. And so we actually invited them over and said, okay, tell us about what it was like. And I remember one of them saying, my mom was so against public education. I really wanted to put together like a notebook of my projects or my work, you know, kind of showing it off or whatever. And she said, no, absolutely not. That's what they would want you to do in school. And so you can't do anything that's anything like school. And she kind of lamented that her mom wasn't a little bit more flexible with the things that she was wanting to do. Even if it was a little, even if it was a little schoolish. But it was interesting for us to hear from people who had been through it. And I think that was all along the way, that's been super helpful because it is kind of feels very out there at first and very radical, and you're not sure. I was the one who had all the questions initially. I was asking the questions that now I'm used to people asking about, well, how, you know, what if they need to learn algebra and calculus, or what if, you know, how are they going to learn certain things, or how are they going to get into college? All those questions. I was the one with a lot of those questions. And my wife, Sarah, was the one kind of explaining, well, you know, I'm reading and listening and learning a lot of this stuff. And so I was a lot slower at first to sort of get on board.
Yeah, that's normal though, because typically one parent is more interested at first, right? And starts doing the research and starts coming up with the ideas and starts questioning the things. So, you know, and then it starts coming up in conversation, right? And then you start having conversations about the questions that the other parent or partner or whomever, you know, has along the way. So it is, I'd say typical, but because that makes sense in our lives when you think about any interest, right? That's often the way it goes, or else you've met somebody else through an interest, right? That you already share, et cetera. So it makes a lot of sense that it goes that way. So speaking of all those questions, what so far has been the most challenging aspect for you of moving to unschooling? What did you kind of find the most difficult?
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that was most difficult was probably the deschooling process for myself. Yeah. So trying to unlearn bad habits, or when things would come up, realize I'm kind of coming at it from assumptions that I've had before, or one thing that was really kind of formative for us, I think, as parents, was when we moved to Bolivia the first time. Our kids were going through culture shock, and we were relatively new parents, and I felt like we were still figuring out this whole parenting thing. And I remember our oldest, Asher, having a really hard time with his emotions and dealing with all the changes. I can look back and see that that's what was happening, but he would get very upset and angry. He wore glasses when he was really young, and so he would throw his glasses, and that set me off and was just like, you can't do that, you know? Yeah. And so I didn't know how to deal with it or how to help him. And I'm very thankful that our organization here, Mennonite Central Committee, has a library for the workers with a lot of books in English. And one of those books is one called Respectful Parents, Respectful Kids, which is based on the work of Marshall Rosenberg, who created this framework called nonviolent communication. And that, I feel like, connected for me up with unschooling a lot of the same themes and ideas of listening, paying attention, noticing, trying to see the behaviors behind, or the needs behind the behaviors, some of those ideas were super helpful for me beginning to deschool, beginning to realize other ways to parent and interact with my kids. And so that's been a long journey and continues, learning how to continue doing better and continue connecting with them and learning more about that. So for me, I feel like that's been the most work is my own work. I could definitely tell lots of stories about my kids and things that were frustrating or things that but when I look back at it, I really do think my reactions or things that were hard were most often more difficult because of me, less than my kids, right?
That is such a great point, and I think that's something so many of us realize after, even a few weeks, a few months into it, is that so often when you first get started, you have no idea the journey or the work that you're going to be doing. Because at first it's like, okay, the kids aren't going to school. They're going to learn other ways. Boom, right? That's where the focus is on the kids, right? But as you start to focus on the kids and seeing how they learn and their emotions and how they're processing, and you're learning about how to engage with them, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, all these questions come up for ourselves, and we begin to see how many expectations or assumptions, like you called them, that we hold that may not be true. And so it's so much about us questioning those things and almost just leaving them more space to be themselves. I found I learned so much just from watching my kids, and they kind of led me down that path of all the questions and things to work through just by what they were interested in, by the situations that came up with them. And it was amazing how much of it is our work to do, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and for us, because our kids never went to school initially in those early years, there wasn't a transition from really getting schooling for them, for getting those schooling messages, and then needing to deschool. Although they did choose to go to school one year, there was an opportunity to go to a magnet school in our town, and it kind of came up all of a sudden, and we asked them if they were interested. They both decided. They had friends that were going, and we told them to we tell you certain things about schooling, but we also want you to have the chance to kind of see for yourself. And they actually had a very good schooling experience when they went for that year. But then at the end of the year, we had a process where we kind of sat down with them, and we made some pro and con lists and talked about what they liked and didn't like, and we let them decide afterwards if they wanted to continue going or stop going. And they were in like second and fourth grade. So even though there are tests, standardized tests in Texas in fourth grade, there wasn't as much pressure really, or too much of the schooling. And they felt like they had a good year, enjoyed a lot of that. But not having that transition period, I think meant that we got to focus more on our own, as parents, our own messages, our own process of deschooling.
Yeah. So was there a big shift? So two things I don't want to forget to ask. A big shift parenting wise for them, because I guess that can be the other piece, not just literally whether or not they went to school, but as parents, as you were talking about nonviolent communication, that kind of stuff, the transition from more control to more connection and working with them rather than, trying to control what they're doing. Was there a shift for them in that area?
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking of these sort of almost embarrassing stories from when you're first a parent and you don't know very much and you're just trying to survive a little bit. And I remember when Asher was first born and we were trying to figure out how to help him sleep. We didn't know anything about attachment parenting or anything. And we kind of misread something about the Ferber method for getting your kids to sleep. And I remember we basically just did this like cry it out method with him. And I remember us huddled in the bed, listening to the baby monitor of him just crying for like 30 minutes and both just like cringing and like, are we doing the right thing? We feel so terrible. No. This is what we have to do. We have to do it this way. This is what it said, even though we had read it completely wrong. And, he ended up being able to sleep fairly quickly for quite a while, of course, until teething and like all those other milestones that disrupt and cause all your work that you've been doing as a parent. And then later on, we realized that we had completely misunderstood the Ferber method, and we felt so bad, and we're like, oh man, we totally messed up. We totally did it wrong, and I remember feeling really bad about that. But we learned more and grew and kind of got over the guilt a little bit of the mistakes that we made. And definitely, I mean, I feel like new parents are always trying to find some control because you're sleep deprived and you have all those bad habits of controlling things in our lives already. And so, yeah, the other thing I think the transition for us that moved us more away from control and forced us to have to wrestle with ways that we were still hanging on to some kinds of control was when we started doing some of the more radical lifestyle elements of unschooling, not just keeping them out of school and living our life, but we, as our kids got older and had devices where they had screens and everybody else is saying limit screen time. And, I guess my story about sleep fits well because, sleep is pretty precious. And I tend to be the one that's very grumpy about sleep. And so the idea of kids being able to decide their own bedtime was real scary. How is that going to work? And my sleep's going to get messed up and I'm going to be just mad. And even this week, actually, the other night, our kids aren't very good about closing doors quietly. And since right now there's no school where we're at, there was a lot of doors just slamming or closing way too hard. And I was getting woken up. And so I got up and was real grumpy. I'm like, you guys, like you get to stay up and decide your own bedtime, but it's not fair to me. I'm trying to sleep here, So that transition to some of those lifestyle things that, especially where it goes against the common sense or the prevailing wisdom,
yes.
Was hard because you have to let go of the control, right? Of what are my kids watching, maybe, and I know what they're watching because I'm interested, and we're talking about it. It's open, yeah. and it's not a big secret, but yeah. So that was another transition that I felt like we took another step towards, in some ways, trusting our kids, I guess, like listening to them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Another transition that my wife was mentioning this morning that I'm reminded was real tricky, continues to be kind of tricky for us. My oldest, Asher, has some issues with anxiety, and he's definitely borderline Asperger's. He hasn't been officially, diagnosed, but he has a lot of the symptoms, and a lot of it like clicks in place when we learn more and talk about it. It really clicks. And so I remember when we were preparing to come to Bolivia, in a lot of places in Bolivia, there's no SPCA. and there's a lot of dogs, and dogs caused him a lot of anxiety. Primarily, we first noticed some of these issues when he had sensory issues with balloons or dogs barking, fireworks, things that, of course, if you get surprised, they scare you, but you're able to kind of regulate and bring your anxiety back down. And his would just go up, and he would be here and in a ball and just like, I can't take it. Right.
Yeah.
And so as like loving good parents, we tried to help him avoid things that were causing him pain and stress and were problems. And we decided before moving to Bolivia this time that let's go to a counselor and see if we can get some help with what can we do to help him with some of these anxieties, because in Bolivia, where there's not SPCA and there's not as much regulation with spay and neutering animals, there's a lot of dogs on the street. A lot of people keep dogs as alarm systems and protection for their homes. And so walking down the street, you could have a dog that's just walking down the street and you'd be nervous about them barking or whatever. And then you also have a lot of dogs behind fences and doors. You can't see them sometimes. And then all of a sudden they bark, and we knew that was going to happen. And one of the things that we learned in going to counseling with him was that his anxiety is not helped by us helping him avoid things. And that was one of the things that we were like, oh, that makes sense. Your anxiety won't get better by avoiding it because you continue to be afraid of it or have those anxieties. You have to work at exposing yourself to it and being able to regulate better your responses and reactions. And you have to kind of go through it in order to work on that. And so that was a hard thing for us, especially thinking about unschooling and allowing kids a lot of choice. We still, we want them to have a lot of choices, but saying, well, with this thing, you kind of need to do it even though you don't want to. And that was hard. It was kind of a little bit of a wrestling, like, oh yeah, we want them to have choices and do what they want to do. But in this area, they're saying for dealing with anxiety, for example, they need to work on it. And then how do you work with them when the kids are saying like, yeah, but I don't want to walk by that dog. Of course not. It causes me stress.
Yeah,
so
that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, in this case, I mean, you guys were moving to Bolivia, right? So there were going to be dogs around, et cetera. So it, helping him that way to be moving through it, to figure out ways to move through it, because it was just going to be a fact of your environment, right? It wasn't going to be something that you could actively avoid, right? And then, I mean, and you work with it and see how it goes, right? I mean, that is fundamentally one of the great things with unschooling is that, you went and you got more information about it. You got some ideas, you worked at it. If that wasn't working for him, you would keep finding new ideas. You know what I mean? What's going to work, if that was just going to be way too much for him to do that approach, to well, you had the right word. I've lost the word, but to put yourself in those situations, right? For moments and to practice dealing with them, right? I mean, if he was going to be so upset and refusing to do that, then you take another step in another direction and figure things out, right? But that's the great thing, is that we are free to get all sorts of information, right? And possibilities and ways to move through challenges and then try them out and see if they're, working for us, if they're a possibility, a way that we can walk, and maybe it's a way you can walk a bit later, or you know what I mean? It's working with the individuals and the people and your environment and your family's choices and bringing that all together to see what works for you, right? I love that, because that's such a great example of just living together, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the other challenge for us living in Bolivia has been schooling. I mentioned before that they go to school now, and initially we said we would try it mainly because they would learn language quicker and they could make friends. And we were really clear with them that it wasn't about grades or anything like that, but we thought it would be an easy way for them to connect with people here and make friends with Spanish speakers and help their language. But we weren't sure initially whether or not continuing to do homeschooling would be an option. And so that was a door that was kind of slightly ajar for a long time. And then eventually the lawyer that works with our organization said, no, this really is not an option. The government actually audits us and all this stuff. And so then we had to go to the kids and say, okay, well, I know we said they're looking into it, but really this is a closed door here. And now we had to say, like, it's the law and you do have to go while we're living here. Of course, we could say, like, well, if that's the case, we're going to move somewhere else. But if we are going to live here and work here, well, we have to figure out how to work with it. And it's been nice for me to see how our kids kind of do differently in the school system and here, and how the messages about schooling have really seemed to have gotten through pretty well. Asher, our oldest, is not very concerned at all about grades. He sees his report card and doesn't care, and it's like, yeah, whatever, I know, but it doesn't seem to bother him too much. Middle child is much more wanting to fit in and belong and make friends. And so she's a little more worried about the grades. And we keep reiterating to her, like, reminding her, especially, you are doing something that's another level from what other people would be doing in school anyways, where you're doing it in a second language. And here there's not really, they do have a Spanish tutor, but the schools don't have help with people who don't speak Spanish as a first language. And so imagine being in North American school systems with zero help on language, and it's just sink or swim. Like, I keep telling them, like, I can't believe you guys are doing any of it. Like, that's crazy, like, that's really, really hard. So, give yourself a break. And then the youngest is kind of mostly in her own world. And so I always kind of celebrate with her when she's doing her own thing in class sometimes. And the other kids are real worried about it. They're like, because it's the big deal. And so they're like telling me, Dorothy's not doing what she's supposed to do in class. And I'm like, oh, okay. All right. Well, thanks for letting me know. And then she shows us some of what she's doing. And the funny thing is, she loves watching YouTube, and she watches everything from these Gotcha Life is one thing that she's really into. So she watches all those videos, but somehow she found a channel that's about numbers and video and letters. And she's just been watching those a ton. And I was like, oh, interesting. So she sometimes she doesn't do school at school, even though she's also learning Spanish and doing a lot of other things. And then she comes home and is like interested in watching videos about numbers and letters. Like, nobody asked her to do that.
No,
So
that's
funny.
Brilliant, because it helps so much for you guys as parents to keep the view bigger picture, right? Life versus in school. And because learning happens all the time anywhere, right? So it must be super fun for you because you can see those moments, right? You can see where she's picking up this kind of stuff here. And I'm sure she's picking up stuff, learning things at school, just not what it is maybe that they're teaching at the moment, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's super cool to look from that bigger picture piece. So I guess, they were all excited to move there. Is this kind of a family decision, how you guys decide where you're going to be going when you're traveling?
Yeah, it was a decision altogether. The first time when we moved to Bolivia, of course, they were too young.
Yeah.
And so we did just drag them along.
Yeah.
But no, they were older. And so we had some conversations and that we were thinking about it. We were applying. We were interested, and along the way had conversations. And they were all very excited about the idea. Of course, you never know what all is going to be in store when you do something like that. But they thought it was an adventure. And our term here is for 3 years. And so they also knew that we would be moving back after 3 years. And that, I think that helped have a little bit of a time frame for them, getting to kind of go on an adventure for 3 years. And it's, they continue to be part of that conversation especially with schooling has been a process. They weren't all very excited about it. And it's been a process getting through, okay, well, if school is something we have to do while we're here, mm-hmm. how can we work on making the best of it and getting through it? And they've all kind of worked to figure out how to make it work for them. And so it's been good. It's been a bit of a hard transition the first year, especially as everybody mm-hmm. kind of gets adjusted. But
it sounds like, you were talking about each of them, and, it mm-hmm. sounds like they are kind of finding their niche, and it is, again, just a great opportunity for conversations, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And there are different conversations with each child, right? That's mm-hmm. the other awesome piece about being individuals. With your son, he's like, yeah, whatever, I'm there, I'm doing my things. He is not feeling, I guess, so much of the judgment or framework of the mm-hmm, school mm-hmm. or feeling the need to satisfy it, and then more conversations mm-hmm. with your daughter, right? About, okay, that is the framework. Mm-hmm. That's what they're looking for, bigger picture. You're still you. It's not about how they define you, and you have the choice to meet the things that they're looking for. It's not an mm-hmm. expectation. It doesn't define you, what your choice is, right? And then Dorothy's just being Dorothy, which is awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is the best thing about your Bolivia days right now? What are you guys most enjoying about it?
Yeah, well, when there's not kind of a national strike going on like there is now after an election, we're a little bit stuck at home. I've really enjoyed being able to take vacations deliberately sometimes when there's school, and say like, hey, we're okay with it and don't mind, and as long as the school isn't giving us a hard time about it. We're okay taking vacations when other kids have to be in school. And so that's fun, getting to visit different parts of the country. We've done some vacations in the Amazon. There's a town called Villa Tunari that is right at where you go one way and you're in the Andes Mountains, and the other way and you're kind of in jungle. And so that kind of stuff is really fun to see and visit different places. I had a note on one other thing that I really am enjoying right now that I'm forgetting. Let's see. Oh, yes. And I was going to mention this, that because the kids are going to school, sometimes I have to help them because their textbooks are, even Asher, who's in 8th grade in his school, my Spanish is pretty good, but 8th grade textbook Spanish is still pretty hard, when you think about it.
Yeah.
And so for like his class, when they're learning about history, or in Lydia's case for, social studies and language, I needed to help them with translating and reading their textbooks somewhat. And that has been super fascinating. So I remember one time helping Lydia, and it was explaining how the Bolivian constitution is set up. So there are certain rights in Bolivia for indigenous people to have representation in the government. And so it's very different. So each group, each indigenous tribe is allowed one representative without any election. They get to appoint somebody to be a representative. They can also run in an election to be elected as a representative. but they're not that one representative. And so that way they're trying to find a balance in representation for all the groups, but also representatives that represent all the people. And I remember reading that and translating it for her and thinking, oh my gosh, she would never be learning this anywhere else. This is so cool, you know? All the geography is about South American geography, the provinces in Bolivia and the different cultures within Bolivia and the different regions, all of that kind of stuff. History and even the stories that you read in like a language arts kind of class are about legends from the Incas or the Guaranis or the different groups that in Bolivia everybody hears growing up about certain characters in Incan tradition, Incan folklore. So that kind of stuff has been really cool, even though it's not about them like needing to know it to get a grade, but just reading it and then being like, wow, you would never learn this if we were, even in the States, if we were unschooling, you might not have been exposed to that, you know? And so it's an aspect of world schooling that I really love, just them getting to see these perspectives just by being in a different place, you know, that you wouldn't really, unless somehow you really got into Latin America, maybe, I don't know, it's possible, but it's less likely, right? But when you're in a place and surrounded by a culture, you get exposed to lots of different things. And that I really, really enjoy and love that they get to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and that is something that I see with families who like to travel, right? They really enjoy that aspect of learning more about the culture and the history of the places that they're in. So, you know, to me that is, you know, because different families have different like interests and ways to connect. Like I'm just imagining you guys over the textbook figuring out what it says and having a really fun connecting conversation around it all, right? You know, so it is about what different families enjoy doing, and those are the family conversations that come up, right? Something that the different people in the family enjoy. You know, it's what inspired you guys to even start talking about going there, right? I imagine part of that is the adventure and excitement of checking out a new place for an extended period of time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely would say that mixing schooling and unschooling is very difficult. That's probably been the experience of a lot of people. So I'm just thinking, as you were talking about reading these textbooks together, it's a mix, right? Like there's a mixture of this feeling of like, I don't want to deal with the school being mad at me about their grades or something. And there's a little bit of rebelliousness and unschooling principles that I try to come back to. But it's really hard to be in that environment and not feel the pressure and the influence sometimes. And we've had to, you know, I want to be honest about that, like journey and what that's like, because we come back to our unschooling principles, but usually it's because we've been pulled in a certain direction and feeling like, how do we make this work, you know, and needing to make it work sometimes feels like, well, just going with it, you know. And so needing to come back to our principles and saying like, no, remember, we don't agree with that, or we don't believe in that. And so how can we do this in a way that honors that and continues to go in that direction, even though we're in a situation where schooling is required.
Yeah. It's not a choice you have in this particular environment right now. But yeah, and it goes right back to what you were saying at the beginning, right? How much of this lifestyle is our work, right? Like you said, you're noticing when you're getting pulled. And yes, definitely. It's easy. I mean, and it doesn't go away. Even if it's not school, it's conventional expectations when, you know, on teenagers. It's conventional expectations when you hit 18 and young adults. And, you know, as parents, we're always pulled by those things. We're always reminding ourselves who we want to be as parents, right? And reminding ourselves about the principles that we want to live by and figuring out how to navigate those, right? So yeah, right now the school piece is what is mixed in with your lives, right? So yeah, reminding yourselves about, it's not grades, and then questioning yourselves. I love that point you made about, how much do we need to satisfy the school so that they're not upset with us? And then it's the questions, well, what would happen if they're upset with us? Is that a horrible thing? Will the world end? What will happen? Is that something we really need to be, all those questions to work through that. Yeah, no. So thank you very much for bringing that up. And it's a bigger picture thing. Like, even when you guys are no longer there are going to be other things that come up about those conventional kinds of questions, and that's life. That's living an engaged life, I think, where versus just doing what's expected, because there's expectations at all ages, right? And you can just kind of feel like, I just want to go with the flow and do whatever I'm supposed to do, or I'm going to figure out what it is for me, the person I want to be, the parent I want to be, what this means for me, what choices are we going to make within the context of your lives and the bigger picture choices that you're making. So yeah, it's all, it's not easy. It's never easy, right?
Right.
Which leads so beautifully into the next question, because I wanted to talk about your podcast. Yeah. It's not easy, as people. I wonder, listening in the audience, as you said, I don't want it to make life seem easy or anything, and it's the same with all our guests. We've thought through these things. We've come across these challenges, and we continue to, right? So it's we talk about how we work through them, the benefits that we see with them, with our children, our life together. That's what's so fascinating, why I've had 200 episodes now, because these conversations are fascinating for me, right? So, yes, you recently started a podcast that's called We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land.
Yeah.
I would love to hear the story behind that.
Yeah, well, I used to write a blog, a couple different blogs, but the latest one was called What Would Jesus Eat? And it was during seminary. I was kind of processing a lot of things I was thinking about in terms of food and agriculture, sustainability, along with theology and reading the Bible. And so I was kind of blogging about that. And so when we lived here in Bolivia before, I wrote a lot. I did a lot of writing and kind of processing that way. And so I kind of thought I would pick that back up, being back in Bolivia. And I had read a book that I was really thinking a lot about and trying to figure, how do I process this? And wasn't motivated to write really. And so somehow, I'm not remembering how the idea came up. Somebody mentioned, like, what if you did a podcast? And I thought, oh, podcast, I could do a podcast. Haven't really thought about that. I'm not like a audio engineer or anything. This is kind of new to me. And so I spent a long time kind of thinking, well, what would it be about? How would I? And there was a good friend of mine who, when I was kind of throwing out this idea online, said that she really appreciated how I'm able sometimes in conversations online, she's seen, and offline too, but a lot of times online, having conversations that are really difficult and heated, and sort of these like Facebook arguments about whatever topic of the day, right? And where you don't agree, but you find ways, and that comes back to nonviolent communication and that whole learning process of how do you listen to people well, and how do you have conversations that can honor what's going on with people, even when maybe they're communicating very poorly, and find ways to not necessarily agree on everything, but have better conversations. And so then that started to sort of form into this idea of a podcast where we talked about those things. We had hard conversations. I did an episode with a filmmaker who made a film about abortion in Argentina. And that's still one of the ones I feel most nervous about because it's such a heated topic. And I feel like it was sort of one side of the conversation and I didn't have more of the other side. And, so there are things that make me nervous about it. But also, I've had a lot of conversations with people about tips or ideas or methods, different things that help us have better conversations. So that part, I think, is hopefully helpful to people thinking about how do we try to have good conversations. And then I've also had a number of episodes talking to people that I know that are different. I have a good friend in Oaxaca that recently had an episode with, a friend in Kenya that works with the same organization that we work with. And then one of my good friends from college who is Cherokee, Lutheran, and Two-Spirit. So we talked to him about what that means. And so also learning about different people and understanding, hearing their stories and talking to them about what makes them different. So I kind of got excited about the idea and started making lists of all the cool people I know that I wanted to talk to. And of course, you made the list. I wanted to talk about unschooling, and I thought this would be great if Pam will talk to me. And so I had you on the podcast, and that episode's not out yet, but I'm excited for people to hear that. That was super fun.
It was fun.
Again, talking about the things that are difficult when it comes to choices we make about parenting or schooling that are different. And I felt like a lot of interesting things came up as we were kind of exploring that together. So it's been super fun, and I'm wrapping up 21 episodes and scheduling them to release and planning on maybe taking a little bit of a break while I have some time, and then scheduling some more interviews and keep going, because it's been, like you said, you've done 200 plus episodes now, and every episode I feel like I find something new that I have learned, or something that I didn't think about that way before, even if it's something that I feel like I do know something about. And another thing that comes up over and over and over again is curiosity. That this cultivating curiosity is a huge part of being able to have hard conversations with people. And that just connects perfectly with unschooling. And that's what we're doing, is cultivating that in ourselves and in our kids,
Yeah, no, I loved it. And I had a really fun conversation with you. That is something, I have conversations on the podcast. I love connecting with people where they are and learning more about how they're seeing. It is that curiosity piece. I love seeing how they're engaging in their life, making choices in their life. It's fascinating stuff. So I love the topic, and I will share the link for your podcast in the show notes for people to check out if they're interested. So one last question. What piece of advice would you like to share with dads who are considering or just starting out on this unschooling journey?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of unlearning that dads have to do. We get a lot of messages about how we're supposed to be as parents. And so I think with unschooling, there's a lot of care and nurturing and connecting. And that's not always the message that dads have gotten growing up about what being a good dad is like, whether that's just from culture or from our families of origin. And so focusing on yourself, and as we said before, like doing the work on developing yourself as a better person and a better parent, that has so many helpful ramifications for parenting. And so I really, recommend doing some of that work, kind of unpacking what did you learn about what it means to be a dad, what it means to be a male in your culture, and then what can you, how can you learn and grow in ways that cultivate curiosity and nurture and connect with your kids more. I think that's really hard. And I think the other thing that can be really difficult is learning to trust our kids. We sort of live in a culture where experts are sort of on pedestals and, being experts about things. And we kind of treat our kids that way too. I'm the expert on life because I've been alive longer than you. And usually our kids have a lot to teach us about things that when we kind of take that position as an expert and not as a learner. And I still do it. I still do it all the time because I have a 13-year-old who really likes to argue with me. And there's sometimes where I'm pretty sure he's wrong, like I do know something, right? I know things too, and it's okay for me to know things. But being open to listening and taking a posture that's less as an expert and more like, oh, I heard it differently, and well, let's look it up. Let's Google it. Let's see. And this is still a little bit hard for me to say, but not gloat that I was right, because I really love being right. It feels good to be right. But being able to say like, oh, okay, cool. Or finding something that I learned that was different than what I thought maybe. And then still saying, oh, okay. So I was right about this aspect.
This particular thing.
I still got to get it in there. But, I learned this other thing too.
But that, you know what? That's one nice thing too about the kinds of relationships that we have with our kids. Like they're okay when we're right too, for the most part, because it's like, it's not a competition. We're not, keeping track of how many times you were right and I was right and bringing that power into the conversation. It's like, oh man, yeah, you were right. It's not a big deal one way or the other. It's something you can laugh about. It's something that, depending on the moment, nobody may even mention in the moment. Again, it's about the individuals and it's about feeling out how the conversation's going, right? And are you going to be, putting a block in the way with the next thing that you say, or are you going to be keeping it open, keeping it engaged, keeping it curious? Because that's the other thing. It's so interesting to find out how they came to that fact or that piece of information or that perspective, because that's one of the things we learn as parents, right? That so much less of what we think is right or wrong. Like facts, yes. But then again, sometimes there's perspectives. Context probably is the best, way to put that too. So it's not just about that one little piece of information. It's about the web. How does that piece of information sit? Where did you pick that up? How might that have got, it's all really fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. One area I remember that my kids, and I think the idea that they like to challenge and they like to sort of push things, and it's not always about whether or not they're actually right or wrong. Sometimes it's just about asserting themselves as having opinions or having ideas. And I know for a long time, my kids were really into, the two oldest especially, were really into conspiracy theory videos on YouTube. And they would talk about flat Earth and some of these things. And it really kind of, like, I would get worried and like, oh my gosh, like I need to. And I do think media literacy is important, right? We should be trying to, well, how do you know whether or not that's true? How do you know it's possible conspiracies exist, but how would you know whether or not to trust that was real, And part of me wants to just say like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. You can't, and I remember Lydia coming to me and wanting to argue with me about that it was that the earth was flat, and very earnestly and seriously. And I had a hard time knowing whether or not she was serious,
Yeah.
And it turned out she wasn't actually serious. She just really enjoyed trying it out and making those arguments and what would I say, how would I respond, and all of that kind of stuff. And then she was kind of laughing about it and being like, yeah, I know, Dad, I don't really think that that's true. And it almost kind of put me at ease a little bit. But again, it's this thing of like trusting them. Like, I don't have to assert that they have to believe me because I'm the authority or because I'm the expert. I can trust that if I have a conversation with them, I can throw out ideas or ask good questions, and they can learn how to figure some of those things out for themselves. And it doesn't have to be because I said so, or because, I know more than you, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
We can trust them to figure it out together,
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Because so often, right, it's keeping that conversation open and going and being curious so that, because eventually chances are you'll find out what it was, what their motivation is, right behind it. Because so often what we see on the surface at first really isn't it, like you said, it wasn't about flat earth. Right? It was really about, engaging in that conversation. Can I convince, how would I do in a conversation like that? Right. And you were the willing participant for her at the time.
At least somewhat willing. It was
somewhat willing. Yeah. Maybe with your eyes going, what do I do?
Yeah. Oh boy. Here we go. Yep.
But yeah,
exactly.
So often, like you said earlier too, right? We learn so much from our kids, and they are so much more capable than, conventional ideas tell us at first, right? And building that trust, that they're exploring this world and having those conversations about media literacy, all the, information. I mean, just all those conversations, and things don't have to be solved in that moment, right? Or figured out in that moment. It's an ongoing process of building those skills, building that understanding, knowledge, all that kind of stuff builds up over the years. And it's not even school years anymore, right? Because you and I, we're still learning all the time, aren't we? Right? So this is kind of a life.
Yeah.
So that was awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lucas. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was super fun, and I'm excited. I know that my wife is really excited to listen to my episode when it comes out.
Oh,
she would never want to be on the podcast herself, but she's really excited that I got to talk to you.
That's awesome. Hi. And before we go, where can people connect with you online? I'll share your podcast website. Is there any other way? Is that the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, the podcast is at wdtatpodcast.com, and then all the social links and stuff are on there, and that's probably the best way to find me and connect with me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lucas. Have a great day. Bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.